Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Views That Matter, Race and Opinions on Climate Change of Boston Area Residents Policy Briefing. We're so glad that you all have joined us today. I'm Rebecca Hurst. I'm the director of the Sustainable Solutions Lab at UMass Boston. We are a research institute at UMass Boston focused on understanding the disproportionate impacts of climate change on historically marginalized communities and working with them to develop sustainable and equitable solutions. We're a partnership of 5 different colleges at the university and the 4 racial and ethnic institutes. So we have a lot of transdisciplinary partnerships and expertise that cuts across the university as a whole. And we're so thrilled that you're all here with us today. Unfortunately, Chief Crockett was unable to join us. She had a last-minute emergency come up, but that's okay. We will proceed. We are recording this webinar, so if you are interested in sharing it with others, you can reach out to us and we'll be able to share that with you as well. Please, during the presentation, feel free to use the Q&A feature, or you can put things into the chat. We will be monitoring both. And I also wanted to just thank our sponsors for this work, the Barr Foundation and the Hyams Foundation. It's been really a pleasure to partner with them on this research, and really exciting to get an understanding for the first time of the differences in different communities of how people are understanding and experiencing climate change. So before we, let's see. So we are going to get started now, and I'm thrilled that our new Chancellor, Marcelo Suárez-Orozco, has joined us today to help provide some context for this report and a framing for our conversation. Chancellor Suárez-Orozco is new to UMass Boston. He joins us from UCLA, where he was Dean of the College of Education, and he brings with him real expertise in migration, education, and an increasing interest in issues of climate change and how it impacts all of these different crises in an intersecting way. So thank you all again for joining us, and with that, I will hand it over to you, Chancellor.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon. I can't, I'm unable to open the videos, but can you hear me?
We can hear you, and
thank you so much.
Try and open the video for the Chancellor.
Okay, let's see. Yes, terrific. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Rebecca. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this extraordinarily important virtual briefing. Where we can listen, we can learn, we can dialogue in endeavoring to understand the voices of communities that often are not heard and are not part of the conversation on one of the existential topics of our times, and that is the issue of unchecked climate change and its devastating impacts in communities throughout the Commonwealth, the nation, and around the world. I want to start by thanking our scholars, the authors of the report, led by University of Massachusetts Boston faculty members. I am very grateful to Dr. Estrada-Martínez, Dr. Watanabe, Dr. Rivera-Kentz for their research, for their scholarship on this defining topic of our times. I want to also acknowledge the extraordinarily important work of the University of Massachusetts Sustainable Solutions Lab and its director, represented here today with Rebecca Hurst. I also want to thank the City of Boston, of course, the Chief Equity, Ms. Crockett, who cannot join us today. We wish you the very best. We are Boston's only public research institution I believe UMass Boston's mission to stand with the city and the state and to be the leading academic and research partner in addressing the most challenging issues of our time. As Professor Watanabe shared with me in the founding charter of UMass Boston, it reads, "We are here to take the battle wherever the battle is." And make no mistake, the battle today is the venomous, noxious, radioactive synergies between racialized inequality and unchecked climate change. These are domains that UMass Boston will continue to be at the forefront, particularly studying, reflecting, examining the consequences of these cataclysmic formations on our most underserved populations. Today's briefing at the nexus of two fundamental issues facing our world today: climate change, unchecked, and racialized inequality. For too long, people the world over have thought that climate change would be a problem 2-3 generations down the road. A great scholar, a great physicist, Indian colleague of mine, once said when he started doing his basic research on unchecked climate change, this was going to be his grandchildren's problem. And it was going to be a problem that lived in faraway cities, faraway contexts, dealing with landslides or hurricanes. Today, unchecked climate change is here. It's in our backyard. It's not our grandchildren's issue. It's our issue now and moving forward. Climate change is our problem to solve, and it is happening right here in our own backyards. As a coastal city, as a harbor city, we are feeling the effects of climate change up close and more acutely than many other cities. All you have to do is come visit us and walk with us down Morrissey Boulevard after it rains to see the flooding. The impact of climate change is being felt in Columbia Point, in the Commonwealth, all over our country. Before I came back to the Commonwealth, I had the pleasure of serving as the dean of UCLA's oldest school, the School of Education and Information Studies. Living in LA, I dealt with ashes in my backyard, day in and day out, from the out of control wildfires raging all over California. We have normalized cataclysmic formations, and that would no longer do. We need to get in front of unchecked climate change, unsustainable development, unsustainable consumption, and it is through scholarship, it is through hearing all voices that we will begin to move the needle on this existential issue of our times. In each instance, those who suffer the greatest consequences are underrepresented populations, which typically in our country are people of color. If we're going to find solutions, if we're going to get in front of the cataclysmic dynamics that continue to gain kinetic momentum, we need to do this in ways that are authentic, in ways that are inclusive, in ways where all voices, all perspectives, all ideas are part of the conversation. And this is the conversation that we are having this afternoon with leading experts from ours, Boston's great public research university. Thank you for joining us, and I turn the program over to Dr. Hurst. Thank you kindly.
Great. Thank you so much, Chancellor, for that clear and urgent call to action and underlining of the challenges that we're facing. And I now am very pleased to hand over the proverbial mic, to Dr. Lorena Estrada-Martínez and Dr. Paul Watanabe, who led this research project. And they'll share a little bit more about the genesis of it and their findings. Take it away.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you very much. And thank you, Chancellor, very much for your leadership. And I want people to know that there is a real strong leadership at UMass Boston now in support of the various issues that he raises that brings people to this sort of policy briefing and others that I'm sure that focus on issues of racial disparity and equity and issues like climate justice, and whether it's in this area or it's in education, no matter what the area, we have a strong ally in the Chancellor, UMass Boston, and I'm very pleased to say that. And that his support for this work is really genuine and natural, and he will become a partner not only with people like us at UMass Boston, but with people throughout the city and throughout the area. And we have a real strong ally and really strong leadership in his ascension to become our Chancellor. We really welcome him to this effort. I want to thank Rebecca as well for her leadership of the Sustainable Solutions Lab. And I want to thank Chief Crockett, who we talked about our study. She was very excited about being able to give an introduction to this. Unfortunately, she was taken away at the last minute for another engagement then, but she very much showed her interest in this work. And we're very pleased to say that she really gave her endorsement of this project when we discussed it with her earlier. And we miss her participation today. As Rebecca pointed out, the Sustainable Solutions Lab at UMass Boston a couple years ago developed a strategic plan that articulated, first of all, the lab's mission to understand the disproportionate impacts of climate change on vulnerable populations and to work with them to develop sustainable and equitable solutions. And secondly, it sought to define a vision to realize a future in which the effects of climate change do not unjustly burden vulnerable communities or exacerbate current racial, economic, and other inequities. With support from the Barr Foundation, SIZZLE, as we call it, has been engaged in this plan. Examples of the responses include first in the governance structure of the Sustainable Solutions Lab. It's very unusual that it is a entity at UMass Boston that has the leadership of 5 deans of 5 different schools or colleges. Colleges that include the environment, policy and global studies, nursing and health sciences, liberal arts and management. And the addition of the leadership of the 4 racial and ethnic institutes at UMass Boston, the Trotter Institute, the Gaston Institute, the Institute for Asian American Studies, and the Institute for New England Native American Studies. This is an unusual framework, but you're going to see it reflects the vision and the strategic plan vision that I just articulated. And that leadership is reflected, first of all, in the governance of SIZZLE. Secondly, this manifestation of this new strategic plan and vision is reflected in the research that we do as well. And that is reflected in focusing directly on the impacted communities, including people of color. And the way in which they experience climate change is very much the central focus of much of the work of the SIZZLE lab as a part of our strategic plan. And to begin with, in doing this analysis, we asked ourselves, where do we want to begin our research if this is going to be our focus? And the question we want to begin with what these communities think about the issue of climate change. In other words, not so much a discussion has always been made about how it impacts these communities, but we want to begin with an initial question. How do these communities that are impacted first think about the issue of climate change? Let's go to the basics. Let's ask them first about how they think about issues of climate change. And that was the genesis of the project which led to this particular report in this particular study. And so we decided how to do this, and the next slide will indicate some of the principles we brought to bear in this. In doing this study, we were guided by a couple assumptions, and one is interdisciplinarity. And you'll see that when we thought about Professor Estrada-Martínez and a graduate student in applied sociology, a PhD student, Katsi Rivera Kintz, that we brought together somebody in applied sociology. I'm a political science, and we brought somebody in the school environment like Lorena. So we already are modeling the idea of interdisciplinary research in bringing to bear on this particular project. We also brought to bear the notion that was critical to what we said, which is not about us without us. This is very much a slogan that was developed in terms of the disability movement here in the United States, but applies to our work as well. That is to say, if we're going to focus on issues of race and impact of people on color, we have to have people of color and people involved in the research itself. And therefore, we brought together researchers that were from those communities and make sure that whatever project we do, we have the involvement at least of some researchers from those particular communities. And another principle and another idea that we brought to bear on this was the idea of trying to support young scholars. And that, again, somebody like Assistant Professor Lorena Estrada-Martínez is one of those young scholars. And even younger than that is a young PhD student like Katsi. And the idea is that we want to bring people into this work and to engage them in this work and excite them, involve them in this work. And I think we've done that principle as well as get reflected in our work. And finally, we wanted to involve community partners as much as possible, particularly in Boston, in the Boston area. When we work on these projects, it really focuses on these communities of color. We want to involve community partners as much as possible in the performance of these projects. And in this respect, we brought together two foundations, community foundations who provided funding for our project. The Barr Foundation, as pointed out, providing support for the larger initiative in terms of what CISL's strategic planning is. And for the Hyams Foundation, it plays a critical role in this particular project that we did in terms of surveying the populations of color in the Boston area. And we're very grateful for their support, the Hyams Foundation and the Barr Foundation both. And we relied as well as on CBOs as well, as you're going to see in a later stage of this report of this project, which is going to go beyond the survey and involve focus groups. We're going to involve directly partnerships with CBOs and communities of color as well in our project. So this principle of community partnerships is also reflected in this research as well. So let me say something very quickly about the survey administration and how we did the survey. The next slide. So as you see, the survey was administered to over 900 people of color within the Boston area. And the 900 people of color included 200 people, at least 200 people from each of the major racial groups within the Boston area: Blacks and African Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, and whites. And this is the most largest and most comprehensive study ever done of populations of this with representation from populations from these four major racial groups. And that is a significant achievement. It's the most important, I think, and most significant large study that involved the views of large collections of people from the racial communities, residents of Boston area. And this is in contrast to many other studies that have been done, including in Massachusetts, that rely on large representative statewide samples, which are fine in and of themselves, but they're not able to focus because of the size of the populations and the size of the samples adequately on the views, particularly of various views of people of color. And we specifically decided to go forth and try to add these elements to already a statewide representative sample that was being done by the Mass Inc. polling group on these matters. And we actually developed a process by where we were able to oversample the 900 residents of the greater Boston area to get the views of at least 200 representatives from each of the major communities of color. That's the most significant achievement of this particular project. The survey was conducted at the end of 2020, it turns out, and the results were made available to us in early 2020. The survey was in the field at the end of 2019, and the results were made available to us in early 2020. But we were supposed to follow the survey immediately with focus groups. And then as we began the process of doing the focus group methodology to do a mixed methodology process, we ran into the COVID-19 problem. And therefore we had to postpone the the focus group idea, and we decided to go ahead and publish just the results from the survey, knowing that it would be followed up by focus groups, which I'm grateful to say that even though we're in the virtual environment, we've decided to go ahead and have virtual focus groups, which will be commencing soon in the 4 communities of color, and we'll point that out in a minute in terms of the focus groups. The survey was conducted to adults 18 and over, and it was conducted in English and Spanish, and it was done by telephone and by online vehicles. And as I pointed out, it was done in October and November of 2019. And some of the instrument survey topics included general demographics, of course, perceptions about ecological and health-related topics, the seriousness of the issue of climate change, the causes of climate change issues, some issues about policy support, levels of preparedness, capacity to stop climate change and its ill effects, and the role of federal government and other agencies in responding to the climate change challenge. And in addition, the report is really divided, as you'll see, into 2 parts. One part which looks at the comparisons between various racial groups and their responses to various questions, and a second part which does a profile of the various views of each of the communities. So for example, Black responses to these questions are highlighted in a profile of their responses. Latino, Asian American, and white responses are all profiled together in the second part of the report. So and then as I indicated, we're going to follow up with focus groups, which are going to begin. They're going to have focus groups 2 from each of the communities of color. We're going to work with community partners to some degree. The UMass Boston Racial and Ethnic Institutes are going to conduct the focus groups, and they're going to be done in language depending on the population. For example, in Chinatown, it'll be done within Chinese dialects, in other and Spanish dialects as well, Spanish language in other areas. And this will add a rich element of focus groups to this survey, which we always intended to do, and we're going to go forward, but let you know that we decided to report on the survey itself and not wait to the focus groups, but the whole package is going to give us even a richer view beyond what the survey results tell us. And so with that, I do want to say that we want to give you some flavor of what some of the findings are. It's impossible, as you will see, that we asked a number of questions, so it's impossible to get through all the data. But my associate, Lorena, is going to really spend some time and summarize some of the key results from the study, and then we'll take some of your questions later on. So Lorena Estrada-Martínez, professor at UMass Boston in the School of the Environment.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming this afternoon. As has been said, I'm Lorena Estrada-Martínez. I'm a social epidemiologist and assistant professor at the School for the Environment in the Department of Urban Planning and Community Development. I am here today to talk about the results of our study. Just as a preempt, all of these analyses were weighted to make sure that the results were proportionate to the size of the respective groups in the greater Boston area. Now, we really wanted to understand what were the opinions and experiences of people of color when it came to issues of climate change. So we asked a number of questions about, again, opinions, experiences, what policies and lifestyle changes they seemed as reasonable given the magnitude of the problem, and how they viewed their own risk and vulnerability when it came to climate change emergencies. And my apologies, I'm looking at a few screens as I control the slides. Now, we first asked residents about their perceptions of climate change, of their reality and seriousness. Now, the good news is that regardless of race, everybody in our study, or most people in our study, believe that it is real, that the consequences are very serious, and that it is not too late to prevent the worst. So to begin with, we asked that critical question, is climate change happening? And the results of our study show that over 85% of people, regardless of race, believe that it is happening. Now, there is a statistical difference in the lower I hope you can see my cursor, on the lower end here, where twice as many white and Black residents in the area believe that it is not happening compared to Asians and Latinos in the area. So that is something of note. Now, after determining that it is happening, the next question we asked was about the seriousness of the consequences of climate change. And once again, regardless of race, the overwhelming majority of Boston area residents believe that if left unaddressed, the consequences will be quite serious. Now, this is actually a very interesting finding. When we ask people about it exists, the consequences are serious, then we ask people about the causes of climate change. And the majority of Asian and white residents believe that it was due to human activities alone, whereas the majority of Black and Latino residents attributed climate change to both human and natural changes in the environment. And that's something that we hope to really follow up on in the focus groups that we're about to start in the next few weeks. Now, we also found that although people really think that it is happening, they also think that it can be stopped, with Asian Americans being the most optimistic of all of the groups that we asked. Now, white residents are more likely to believe than residents of color that climate change is actually going to have a differential impact across different groups in Massachusetts, and those were defined as social groups, not necessarily, we didn't define it specifically. We let that the respondent define that for themselves. But this then really raises the question about what is it that different groups of color mean or interpret by equal versus unequal impacts of climate change. And there's a few things that might be going on here when it comes to the frame of reference that people are using. And again, this is something that we hope to really get into in our focus groups. Now, we asked a series of questions about the role of government and issues of policy, which I know a lot of you are very interested in. So I'm going to go ahead and jump into that. Now, we asked people whether addressing climate change will require changes in their behaviors and their lifestyles, and they overwhelmingly agreed that it would. Now, we also then asked them about their opinions of government responses, and basically Boston area residents agree that major policy changes are necessary to address issues of climate change. So I'm going to go into this very complicated graph, and I'm not going to go into a whole of the details here, but I do want to point a few things out. And again, this is in the report, so I don't want you to bog down too much in all these bars. But I just wanted to point out that when we consider issues that should be high priority, that the residents of the greater Boston area identified as high priority, over 60% of all residents said that global warming should be high priority for the state of Massachusetts. Now, we also kind of wanted to point out that Black residents in particular addressed or sort of defined more things as high priority than other groups. And that there's also an issue of language here. We asked half of the residents, we used the terminology of global warming, and half of the residents were then asked using the terminology of climate change. And it seems that people are still people of color are much more familiar with the term global warming. And so that was identified as a top priority at a greater rate as opposed to the term climate change. Now, what's behind this is actually a great debate among scientists, but it's actually really important for us to note when it comes to engaging community and public education and using terms that are the most relevant for each of these groups. Now, over 80% of Boston area residents understand that significant policy changes are needed at both the federal and state and Massachusetts state government level to stop climate change. And this was specifically to reduce carbon pollution at enough levels, sort of at a rate to stop climate change. We also asked respondents about how they felt with regards to the state and their own cities or towns addressing issues of climate change ahead of other similar jurisdictions. So should Massachusetts be ahead of the curve? Should my city or town be ahead of the curve? And again, the majority of respondents feel that they should, right? That the Massachusetts really should be a leader in the country, and that their own towns and cities should be moving forward, independent of whether others are moving forward at the same pace. And again, Asian Americans are actually the more likely to think that their towns should move ahead at a greater pace. Now, when we presented people with specific policy proposals indicated here in the slides, people of all racial groups were overwhelmingly in support of all of the 6 proposals. Now, for example, over 85% of residents across all of the racial groups supported improving the public transportation system in the area, so we would reduce car travel, and with that, we would reduce carbon emissions. Over 80% of all residents supported restoring wetlands that would then serve as buffers against flooding. People really wanted government to use these tools to address issues of climate change. But there were really also some interesting results when it came to opposition to some of these policies. For example, over a fifth of white residents were actually opposed to the idea of charging gas companies a fee that would then be used for clean energy projects. They were also the most likely to be against providing local governments with state funding to be used for climate change and clean energy related projects. Now, when it came to perceptions of preparedness, we asked people, how do you feel about your region, your neighborhood, your family, and a series of questions of specific actions that they may or may not have taken for preparedness. So the first few questions we asked about the ability of, or the perceptions of how low and high income neighborhoods were prepared to withstand extreme weather events. So most residents of the completely thought that low income neighborhoods were not at all prepared to withstand these kinds of events, unsurprisingly. And they were much more likely to think that high income neighborhoods were better prepared. But even in the case of high income neighborhoods, it's actually very few people think that they're very prepared. So that's something that we need to note of. People are generally pessimistic about how prepared their neighborhoods are, or neighborhoods are. Now, one of the starkest racial differences that we found was in the perceptions of preparedness of people's own regions, neighborhoods, and families. Now, again, this is referring to themselves, right? So we found that Asian Americans were very pessimistic about their own levels of preparedness at every possible level of analysis, region, neighborhood, and families. Whereas other groups were much more optimistic when it came to family. The people sort of felt more in control of things that were closer to their locus of control. So they felt more in control about their families than they would about their regions. Now, this is sort of a dissonance when it comes to their perceptions of general family preparedness and actual actions of preparedness. Now, whereas in the previous slide, 14 to 15% of participants in the study identified their families as very prepared, there's actually a much larger percent of people that in fact had taken some actions for preparedness when it comes to extreme weather emergencies. So much more people had evacuation plans, they had stored important documents in a safe place, they had home or renters insurance, they had at least 3 days of essential supplies, medicine, food, water, that kind of thing. And they had established a concrete communication plan with friends and families in case of evacuation or having an emergency. Now, there were actually some really interesting and problematic racial differences here. For example, 74% of whites had home insurance compared to 54% of Latino and Asian Americans. Now, I'm sorry, went ahead. I ran some auxiliary notes analyses here, and I just wanted to point out a very problematic finding. And we did this sort of in light of the more recent extreme weather events that we've seen. 5% of whites in our sample didn't have any of these sort of 5 elements. They were completely unprepared. That's actually compared to between 20 and 25% of the communities of color that didn't have any of these elements. So that's something that we really need to start thinking about fast as we see the devastation that is happening in places like California and Texas and the general southeast of the United States. Now, finally, residents were asked about the health impacts of climate change, and over half of residents across all of the groups had given at least some thought to the health implications of climate change. And, you know, all of them sort of thought, or most of them had thought, really did agree that climate change was going to either worsen existing health condition or definitely cause new health conditions among, especially among youth. So I'm going to leave it there when it comes to our findings. There are many more findings in the study, and I'm happy to answer additional questions that we have not covered. So. Rebecca, I don't know if you want to.
Sure, yeah, so thank you both so much for that presentation. And as we mentioned before, people can feel free to include things in the chat or in the Q&A. We have one question. What instruments did you use to collect your data?
So this was an established survey instrument that was developed in collaboration between this team with input from folks in the Hyams Foundation and the Barr Foundation, and through Mass Inc., who was the folks that were in the field. Mass Inc. is a professional polling institute. And so it was sort of a group of people where we decided what were the different topics that really needed to be touched upon. There's a sort of a whole science that goes into survey development and survey methodology. So we wanted to make sure that we covered all of the topics, that we are asking really good questions, but we also didn't want to go, you know, the survey couldn't go on and on and on forever. So we're happy to share the instrument. All of the questions with the specific wording of the questions are in the survey report towards the end of the report.
Great.
I'm sorry, the light of my house is making me glow.
Since this is a policy briefing, I'm curious what both you, Lorena, and you, Paul, think are some of the key sort of overarching themes around policy takeaways that would be really important to think about from the findings.
Well, I can say in terms of the policy, the idea of whether climate change is a critical issue, there seems to be broad consensus about it. There also is broad consensus it's an issue that needs to be addressed. And it's an issue that requires action at all levels, individuals and communities and government as well, that all of them need to respond to it. So that's a good thing. So people who are interested in government and policies, they want to make sure that they hope to pursue policies where there's a broad consensus of getting engaged in it. And I think that they can take away from this that there's going to be a broad consensus in doing so. However, in the actual impact of these climate change possibilities, we see broad disparities. And that suggests that in terms of this broad consensus, there are real issues of disparities to address in terms of the preparation of populations. There's a real agenda that suggests that in terms of the broad discrepancies as we see in levels of preparation, sort of the second part of Lorena's presentation. And that suggests a real imperative that there be a concerted effort to have that policy consensus be directed at trying to respond to the disparities in terms of preparation and the potential impacts on these populations. And that suggests both a desire to pursue this agenda and in areas in which that agenda should be pursued. And I think that that's some of the takeaways from this data.
Anything you want to add to that, Lorena?
No, I mean, I think I'm in full agreement with Paul on this one. I think that there's sort of issues of policy that we start that we should really start thinking a little bit outside the box and start thinking about climate in other forms of policy, right? And not just things that say climate change or say environmental issues on a policy proposal or on a bill. We should start thinking about climate change in education, right? And public health and issues that have to do with preparedness of like hospitals and the like. So I would probably try to start broadening how we do climate change preparedness and climate change education across different groups. So that would be sort of where I would also take that.
Great, and sort of an ideal follow-up to that, we have a question from Chief Cook, which is, based on your research for our region's most vulnerable residents, what are the first actions you think policymakers should take?
Paul, you want to take that? Or?
Yeah, I think certainly to respond to the different levels of preparation and the causes of that. And I know it's not a small issue, but it's the bigger issue and the more fundamental issue. It's not it may be the first, but not the easiest issue. And that is the fundamental inequities that underlie all of these responses. And that is to say, we could have a forum as we've had on issues of the impact of the COVID-19 crisis on communities. We could have it on education, and we see that the root causes of all the disparities there are fundamental, and they have to do with wealth, and they have to do with all of those sorts of issues. And to me, if you want to really have an agenda that really talks about the whole expanse of all these areas, then you're going to talk about one that deals with root causes. And that's going to be a way to get at the educational disparities. It's going to get an issue that's going to focus on issues of health disparities. It's going to focus on issues of different levels of preparedness for climate events. But in the short term, certainly for me, the idea that various different communities are ill prepared as they see it from their own perspective based on income and race and ethnicity to respond to the likelihood, and there really is a likelihood that they're going to have these climate events. I think that's a real agenda that needs to be addressed, and we're going to have to see what's behind this perception, which I think does reflect a certain reality as we see in places every day. We see it today in Houston and Texas and all over the Southwest and so forth. These disparities manifesting themselves, and Boston should be no different in terms of those disparities playing themselves out.
I agree with Paul. I'm a social epidemiologist, and I do research both on COVID and on climate change. So I definitely agree that there are, at the end of the day, this is about what we in public health, we call the fundamental factors or the root causes. Whatever the illness is, it changes, but these root causes remain the same. That's why we call them root causes or the fundamental factors. And yes, at this moment, we need to focus on preparedness. When we started looking at the numbers of preparedness, I mean, it's alarming. It's alarming how low the numbers are for everyone. And it's certainly alarming the kinds of disparities that we're seeing, right? The highest number that we saw was that 74% for home insurance, home or renter's insurance among whites in the greater Boston area. That's the most prepared that somebody in any of these groups, were. And that's not that great. That's not a great number. I would like to see that higher. But I'm certainly, when we started doing this additional analyses, these other scores, like, wow, like there's 25% of people in the greater Boston area that are completely, fully unprepared when it comes to having essential medication and water and, heat, like these sort of very basic things. And we have a lot of colleagues and friends and family all over the country, and we get nor'easters and snowstorms. Of course, we're more prepared than Texas is for what just happened. But I can, when I first moved back to Boston in the winter, that horrible winter of 2015, where we had, 8-10 feet of snow within a month, people really were cut off. A lot of people were very seriously cut off, and a lot of them really did not have medication, for example, and they couldn't get to the drugstore for said medication because they didn't really have transportation other than the train, and a lot of the trains had been blocked out. So there's, there are issues here of preparedness that are quite damaging, and they have repercussions beyond sort of the very immediate, obvious ones that we sort of always think about. So that's certainly the one that I would hammer out first, sort of as the more urgent one.
Mm-hmm.
You both mentioned in various ways that you're hoping to dive deeper on some of these key issues in the focus groups. Can you share a little bit more about some of the open questions that you're excited to explore, or places that were a little bit confusing for you that you want to get additional data from the focus groups?
Yeah, one of the classic ones, and we tested this in some of the pilot focus groups that we did before the COVID crisis hit, when we were just ready to go online with those. And for example, as Lorena pointed out, in discussion on one of the questions, we did question wording when we asked about priorities, that sometimes we use the word climate change, and for half of the sample use the word global warming. And I will say, for the mainstream population as a whole, it made very little difference whether you use global warming or climate change in terms of whether it became a policy priority. For communities of color, it made a very big difference for some of them. That is to say, that the language of global warming got a bigger response in terms of a priority than did the language of climate change. And we wondered what may lie behind that. And we're only going to be able to get to that by having a discussion in a focus group. And we did get some interesting discussion of that even in the pilot focus group. But even the language that we utilize, that's something you can't tease out by simply just looking at the survey results. What does the language of climate change mean? And is there a particular different meaning to the notion of global warming? Does it have a particular resonance with certain populations in the way that may not with the mainstream population? So some things, even like the language, are things that we can tease out a bit more in focus groups.
I'm also really interested to understand what is it that people, how did people understand these issues of equity versus inequity? So I'm from Puerto Rico. I'm Puerto Rican. I was born here and grew up there, and I went back and forth. And these questions were done in 2019, and Hurricane Maria happened in 2017. So when I read these questions, it's very likely that a lot of them might have been thinking, like their frame of reference when you say, well, is there going to be equal or unequal impact? Well, they very might well have been thinking of somewhere else, right? Like if you ask me that question, I'm like, well, it'll be in many ways equal because the hurricane came through and destroyed 95% of the power grid on all of Puerto Rico, right? So that might be one place. But the part of the unequalness is about the ability to respond, right? To get back on your feet after a devastating Category 4 hurricane that sort of just hovers over an area for that long. So there might be a very different place of where people are starting at. And I think that's something that we're hoping to get to through the focus groups as well. And the issue of causes of climate change, that was also another piece that I'm really interested in getting at during the focus groups, because that was different, and we haven't always seen that relationship in the research literature. So that's something that I'm looking forward to understanding better.
Yeah, can I comment again on something that Lorena said at the beginning, and that is particularly for immigrant groups, of which is a large portion of those individuals in the area that we talked about. Their frame of reference about groups or community may be quite different than they are for the mainstream population. When we ask what's the impact of climate change on your group or on your community, they might define it as a portion of Boston. It could be Brighton, or it could be the Beacon Hill or something like that. But we find that when we ask this often of immigrants, they perceive their community as not even a localized community. They see it as a diasporic community. They see what's happening back in Puerto Rico or Haiti or the country from which they have ties in terms of diaspora, and they define the community in those terms. So when you ask what are the impacts on your community, they're quite different. And I think this does very much meld with something that our chancellor has told us about all the time, who's an expert on immigration. He pointed out in a discussion we had just the other day of the extent to which climate change is a major force which is promoting migrations of people throughout the globe, moving away from dire climate events and situations to try to find a better place. And that this is a major factor that, and we're seeing it getting played out, and the definition of community is going to impact these sorts of ideas. And I think it's something that's fresh for study. And again, the focus groups is going to be a way we're going to flesh these sorts of ideas out. How they define community, why they came here, and did climate change have something to do with them? And are they seeking climate justice, therefore, in addition to refuge from potential climate events? Those are issues of transnational. Those are the global coming to the local, and not simply local events as we might have perceived it before. And I think we can get a flavor of that through focus groups.
Great. Can you comment on the differences in things like income, wealth, household size, and other indicators between the 4 subgroups?
Okay. So just in terms of demographic differences, if you compared the different groups of color to whites, there are substantial differences when it comes to issues of income and level of education, that those kinds of traditional socioeconomic indicators. That is not surprising at all. That's incredibly consistent with almost, basically everywhere else. If you take them out of the analysis, right, of that comparison, there are fewer differences in terms of how the different communities of color compared to each other in the greater Boston area, right? That's in this particular geographic place. We also did some auxiliary analysis. This is not included in the report, but again, if people email me, I'm happy to share these additional results of how groups were heterogeneous within themselves, how different things might be different for, so say, Latinos that are of different educational backgrounds or levels, attainment or income categories, that those, or gender differences within groups. And we actually found a number of differences that we're hoping to sort of explore and write about in more detail in the coming months. So there were some issues. Some were not surprising. They were actually very consistent with the same pattern that we see among white populations. There are consistent, gender, income, and educational differences, right? People that have higher levels of education tend to be more aware and sort of alarmed by issues of climate change in some ways. But at the same time, issues of higher income means that you're more protected of things that have to do with climate change. And oftentimes it means that you're unwilling to, we saw this in the data, higher income people of color were also less likely to be supportive of policies that were, like the gas fee policies or the policies that had to do with the state giving money to local jurisdictions. So there is heterogeneity within each of these populations. These are not homogeneous populations. So we're hoping that that's going to be something we're going to move into in the future, in the short-term future.
Right.
So I'm happy to share that with anybody who would like to see those numbers more concretely.
Okay, well, we have just a couple of minutes left, so I think we will end with a question from the Chancellor. He writes, the quest for a sustainable planet and for a sustainable humanity must include cradle-to-grave climate literacy for everyone, including children in K through 12, college students, and grown-ups all the way to senior citizens. Students are clamoring to learn science, the environment, and climate change, but we are failing them. Climate change education for all, carefully conceived and well executed, has inherent value and furthermore leads to measurable, desirable outcomes, including individual behavior and attitudinal change, resulting in reductions in carbon emissions of similar magnitude to other large-scale mitigation strategies. Do you have a sense of how families are thinking about education for unchecked climate change?
You know what, we did, that's not a question that we asked, Chancellor. I do agree though, with the general sentiment of what you said. I've had, when I speak to youth, including very, 5th grade, 6th grade, 7th grade youth, and I have these conversations, years ago, I stopped asking, what is it that you want to be when you grow up? And I've started asking, what is it that you want to fix in the world? What is it that you want to address in the world? And like 80% of them say things that have to do with the environment and climate change. So it's a huge number. And these are, activities that have nothing to do with climate change. This is more like, girls in STEM, or, these other kinds of, and a lot of them have, that really is a big part of their focus. I have not yet participated of a study that's specifically asking families, like the parents and other people in their families. So that's a really, really good question. Maybe we should write a proposal about that and try to submit that somewhere.
I want to let the Chancellor respond to his own question because I think he has some insights, but let me say in advance that I think leadership does matter on these issues from the very highest parts of the country. So if you have leadership at the country that really place climate change and the concerns at the center of policy, as opposed to ignoring it or denying it, it has a major impact. And I think the new administration, with the heavy emphasis is placed in terms of focusing on issues of climate, I think is really going to provide some leadership in that realm. And I think that that's going to have an effect on down the line. And it means that governors, and it means that city councilors, it means that representatives, it means that people at city council, at city and town council levels must be concerned about this. And that affects the educational equation, and colleges and universities must be involved with this as well and show some leadership. So I think this vast leadership will trickle down, hopefully, so that the students, their hunger is there. And the question is, we have the will to feed that hunger. And I think it's not simply young people. I think it's older people as well. I mean, I think there's this ageism that sort of suggests that older people aren't concerned about the environment, and that's not true. I think older people, including myself, we're very much concerned about the legacy. We're wondering about what this means for our grandchildren and our children. And I think that's very much a part of this discussion as well. And so, Chancellor, thank you for raising the question, and thank you for, I hope that UMass Boston under your leadership will provide leadership along these lines. So let's give you maybe the last word.
Yeah, me.
Thank you so much. As I like to say, when we come back to face, we're going to spend the first few minutes of every conversation. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
My connection is unstable. Thank you. This was so important. Thank you for the details of the study. I think this is extraordinarily significant. I think I like very much the idea of now moving it to focus groups to get to delve deeper into the cognitive and cultural and linguistic schemas that form our general attitudinal and behavioral orientation towards the environment, towards climate, and towards the path for a sustainable humanity, a sustainable development. So my congratulations. I happen to believe that education is the most powerful lever of change. This is why I strongly believe that the responsibility of education now and moving forward will be to be at the forefront of these issues. And what I see, I'm not a scholar in this domain, but what I see in your data, Lorena, what I see in the study that you presented is a longing, a clamor to really get in front of these issues. We have time. We don't have a lot of time, but we have time. I agree entirely with Paul's reflection that leadership matters. I'm so proud of our beacon, who is now the special assistant to the president, Gina McCarthy, on issues relating to the environment. Secretary Kerry, likewise. So, the great Antonio Gramsci once said, looking at another very difficult time in human history, I am pessimistic by intellect, but optimistic by will. I think we all have to be optimistic by will. There is time, the youth, and I concur, Paul, that this is multi-generational, that it's all communities see, and that's what the data show, what's at stake here. And congratulations. Muchas gracias. Bien hecho.
Gracias.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you all so much for joining us. If you have additional questions, please feel free to reach out. Take care.